Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and I'd like to say a few words about the controversy that's been bubbling along nicely on the Twitter sphere. It concerns Tucker Carlson and an interview that he had with a historian and podcaster, Daryl Cooper. And they covered a lot of ground. It was a lengthy interview, more than 2 hours. And they talked about immigration. They talked about Putin, Trump, the war in Ukraine, and so on. But there was one issue that caused a lot of distress, and that was the discussion of the Second World War. Now, here at the Gaggle, we've talked quite a bit about World War II and the need to re-examine some of the assumptions and premises of World War II. So, what was said between Tucker and Cooper wasn't really anything new, I don't think, to gagglers, but it did cause an explosion because in the United States, particularly, there is a set narrative about World War II, which is that Neville Chamberlain was the bad guy. He wanted to avoid a war, and therefore he allowed the dictators, the bad guys, to get away with whatever they needed to get away with. And then finally, Chamberlain was replaced by the good guy, Churchill, and then a war ensued, and finally, the good guys won, and the bad guys were defeated. So that's the story of World War II, and of course, then that's been applied time and again to every single conflict since 1945. In which we're always confronted by the bad guy who had to be confronted early and defeated so that we didn't have a world war down the road. And of course, this narrative is absurd and simple-minded, but nonetheless, it's very, very powerful, because if you don't see the world in this Manichaean way, as that it's full, the world is full of monsters that have to be slain by the good guy, which is the United States and its various satellite client states. Then, of course, so many of the assumptions of the post World War II, and particularly the post Cold War order, come into question. So what happened in this discussion was that some of the premises of World War II, and particularly how Britain, under the influence of Churchill, got itself into a war that it didn't really need to get into. And more seriously, and this is what I think caused the particular controversy, Churchill kept the war going. He had no ability to win the war, but he kept the war going in the hope that other powers are going to get in sometime down the road, and such the Soviet Union and of course the United States, and then the Britain would prevail. But the price of that was something like 50, 60 million dead. So the question is, well, how was that justified? How is this supposed to be a good war when 50, 60 million people were killed, and the war could have been wrapped up in 1939, 1940? But no one dares to ask that question, and instead, we have the constant celebration of Winston Churchill. So let me first show you the response that this interview elicited on Twitter. And here we have Sohrab Ahmari, whom you may be familiar with, somebody who actually was well thought of by Tucker. Tucker had him on several times. He used to work at the Wall Street Journal and then the New York Post, or maybe he started the Post and then moved to the Journal. And he's supposed to be a kind of America First. He's the editor of Compact magazine that advocates a kind of populist Trumpism, the kind of economic populism that Trumpism needs to be in favor of. So it's pro-union, pro-state interventionism in the economy, but of course going together with essentially non-interventionism and America Firstism of Trump. So it's very interesting that this Sohrab Ahmari, who was on Glenn Greenwald very recently, and only he was complaining about how Trump seems to have abandoned the left-wing economic populism of 2016, though I think it's questionable whether Trump really ever did embrace particular leftish economics. I mean, he was always, he is what he is. He's a billionaire. And he likes capitalism, right? So it was always unlikely that he was going to embrace socialist economics. But anyway, it was very interesting that here's Sohrab Ahmari, whom you might have expected, given his friendship with Tucker and given his association with America Firstism, you might have expected that he would hold his fire. But no, he went into an absolute Twitter meltdown over this interview. So he says here, this is just the same old Hitler apologetics. And then he puts in parentheses, he didn't want to widen the war. They didn't know what to do with all the POWs. So he put them in camps. Remarkably, there isn't any historiography behind it. This, quote, popular historian, unquote, just makes conclusory claims. Shameful. And then Josh Hammer, kind of another Trumpian. He's a columnist on Newsweek, much beloved by America Firsters such as Steve Bannon. He's a regular on Steve Bannon's show, also a regular on Tucker's show. But of course, he's also, and one has to say, an Israel Firster, absolutely unabashedly committed to Israel. So Josh Hammer says, I never necessarily thought we'd see where the American right, I think it was just, he was got a little excited here. I think what he was to say is, I never necessarily thought we'd see the day where the American right has to excise a Leni Riefenstahl wing, but that is sadly where we're at right now. There's a new vote. Leni Riefenstahl. I don't know what is going on about. What's this got to do with Leni Riefenstahl? And then Sohrab again goes on. By the way, there's no new historiography behind this. It's just a stream of conclusory statements presented as facts. But again, you always wonder what the why somebody should get so excited. It's just, it's on Twitter. There's plenty of historical scholarship, so you don't like it, you could always consult and read other historical works and it's not as though, to be honest, historical revisionism really gets much play. So you always feel, why are people so nervous? I mean, I feel the authoritative history of World War II dominates the academy, dominates the media, dominates Hollywood. So who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. So why get so excited when somebody calls this into question? But then he says, it's like those very late night AM radio shows that casually talk about our origins as aliens and star people, except promoted by Tucker as serious history. And then again, Sohrab goes, quote, Churchill was the chief villain of World War II. Now, he didn't kill the most people, but I believe when you really get into it, you see he was primarily responsible. We'll talk a little bit about what he actually said. That's not quite what Cooper said. Much of the right is diving headlong into moral lunacy, just too many cranks and half erudite charlatans. Again, we're really getting quite excited. And then hammer again, if you find yourself just asking questions over whether the real villain in World War II was actually Churchill, maybe pause and consider the distinct possibility that you're actually just a complete fucking moron. And then David French, we know him, he's the New York Times columnist, whereby he fits a particular slot at the Times where you pretend to be a conservative. That's your calling card. You are a, quote, conservative, unquote, but you spend all your time attacking conservatives. That's what you write 2 columns a week in which you trash conservatives, and you've got a free play to do it because, of course, you are allegedly a conservative. So French says, when we talk about the moral and intellectual decline of the right, it's important to remember that people like Tucker and Candace Owens have some of the largest political audiences in America. This is what happens when a movement abandons character. It attracts the worst people and ends up warping, distorting, and confusing good people. So this is his usual moralizing and sermonizing. And then again, Sohrab, at some point it becomes downright unpatriotic. You can see he's having a real meltdown. It's one thing to oppose this or that intervention. I prefer immediate de-escalation over Ukraine. What the hell is de-escalation over Ukraine? I mean, either you want to bring American involvement to an end, or you don't. I mean, de-escalation sounds very nice, which it means essentially whatever you want it to mean, and then that's the whole point. So, and you can see how this person, supposedly an America first or a Trumper, is getting in good with the people who matter. Oh, well, de-escalate. Who doesn't want de-escalation? Yeah, I think de-escalation is fair. But this stuff arises out of a deep hatred of actually existing American order, to the point they apologize for Hitler. None of it is of the slightest relevance, as we'll see when we take a look at what was actually said. The issue of America really didn't come up at all. And then Liz Cheney, and what would life be like without Liz Cheney? She says, actually, this is pro-Nazi propaganda, including Churchill was the chief villain of World War II, and Hitler didn't want to fight. No serious or honorable person would support or endorse this type of garbage. Now, here's what what they said. So here's Tucker says, any unifying myth is important. I'm just highly distressed by the uses to which the myths about World War II have been put in the context of modern foreign policy, particularly by the war in Ukraine. And not just the war in Ukraine, so many others. Churchill's the good guy, Neville Chamberlain is the bad guy. But it also was justified, like the killing of millions of people since the end of the Second World War. And so I do think it's fair to ask, what really was going on. And I'm an American, I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill? And then Cooper says, well, trying to provoke him a little bit. So he's talking about a conversation he had with a friend, and he said that this is what I said to a friend. I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities, but I believe, and I don't really think, I think when you really get into it and tell the story and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland. And I think this is really what's important. I'm not saying Cooper particularly handled himself particularly well or clarified his arguments in a particularly helpful way. In the way they say Pat Buchanan and David Irving as well, I think present their arguments, I think, in a more cogent way. The issue was Poland, which was the German attack on Poland. Now, the issue isn't the nature of the Nazi regime. That's a given. You know, Churchill, Chamberlain, they didn't like Hitler. They didn't like the Nazi regime. Nobody liked the Nazi regime. It was, you know, I mean, with its anti-Semitism, it sort of went back to the Middle Ages. So it was obviously kind of unacceptable, you know, in the modern era for a regime like that. That is a separate issue from whether you should go to war with Nazi Germany. And the only justification for going to war is if your own national interests are absolutely, unconditionally at stake. Now, the fate of Poland was not a British national interest. Britain had never made clear to anyone that Poland's borders were a national interest of Great Britain, and that was clear in 1925 with the signing of the Locarno Treaty. The Locarno Treaty guaranteed the western borders of Germany, and of course the borders of France. That's all that the guaranteed. So those borders were sacrosanct. So therefore, those are the western borders. But there was no eastern Locarno. Germany's eastern borders, or Poland's borders, or Czechoslovakia's borders, they were not guaranteed. So that was, so in other words, it was, the British had made clear that those borders are not a matter of vital national interest to Britain. So the question then is going to war with Poland. Why would Britain want to sacrifice the lives of its young men? Why would Britain want to sacrifice its independence, which is what would be involved? Why would Britain want to sacrifice its empire for Poland? That was the issue. That was the issue that Chamberlain, who's supposed to be the bad guy, but Chamberlain didn't believe that. He said, "Look, I mean, we are a rich but vulnerable empire. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to toss away everything we have for Czechoslovakia or for Poland. You know, we may have sympathies for Poland, we may have sympathies for Czechoslovakia, but we can't just go to war just because we feel some sympathy." So the question is then, when it says becomes something other than an invasion of Poland, and then Cooper then goes to, they launched a new war. They were completely unprepared. This is I think where it's a separate issue where he talks about. Maybe this is something we can discuss on the live stream tomorrow. He talks about the Eastern Front and the atrocities that the Nazis committed on the Eastern Front. And I think it's more questionable. He said that the Germans were unprepared, millions of prisoners of war, and they didn't know how to handle the millions of prisoners of war. And then he says, so it's 2 months after, a month after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, "We can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people." And one of them actually says, "Rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now?" And so this is like 2 months into the invasion, right? So this, I think, is much more questionable, because I think that the executions were planned beforehand, and the mass executions were carried out immediately. So this isn't 2 months. I mean, when it wasn't about, well, they can't feed them. The executions of Jews, commissars, everything that was carried out and was intended to be carried out from the time that the Nazis launched Barbarossa. And that, incidentally, is not something even David Irving questioned. I mean, Irving questioned other aspects of the Holocaust, but he never questioned the mass executions committed by the Einsatzgruppen. So this I think weakens Cooper's case when he's going down this path. And then here again he's talking about the oil fields and well, all right, let's skip this. Let's just focus on the Churchill part. So this is when he's saying in after 39 he defeats Poland. So the war's wrapped up on the German side. Hitler starts firing off peace proposals to Britain, France, because they had already declared war. He didn't expect them to declare war, actually. And I think that he's correct there. He didn't think they would declare war because he didn't think that it made any sense for Britain and France to go to war for Poland. I mean, it was contrary to the policy that was enunciated at Locarno, and then that policy had prevailed since 1925, which is that the eastern borders are not guaranteed, which means that they're up in the air. And then so then Hitler doesn't want to fight Britain. He feels that he's going to weaken that's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the east, the communist threat over there, and he starts firing off peace proposals. And then he goes on. 1940 comes around. They're still at war. And so he launches his invasion of the West, takes over France, and so on. So the point he's making that after Poland had been defeated in September 1939, Hitler turned around and said, "Well, that's it. It's over. Poland has been defeated. There's no point in continuing this war." Because you have no hope of reversing Poland's defeat. And so he's firing off these these peace proposals. The peace proposals are all rejected. And so once he sees that there's no hope for peace, and then he sees what Britain is doing in Norway, and particularly they violated Norwegian neutrality in order to mine Norway's ports, which is all of which incidentally was part of Churchill's plan to deny Germany iron ore from Sweden. Hitler clearly then saw, this is already now early 1940, that Britain and France intend to go on waging this war, and so therefore he really had no choice other than to launch his attack on France, and again with a view to bringing this war to an end, not France out, and then really Britain has to sue for peace. So again, that's why it's crucial to keep in mind Britain's policy of mining Norway's ports, something incidentally that Norway strongly protested about, understandably. They particularly careful, for their ports to be mined. But it was all part of Britain's continuing this war against Germany. But before that, of course, Hitler attacked Norway because, again, he needed to secure Norway in order to ensure the iron ore from Sweden, because obviously the British were seeking to get their hands on that iron ore. And so anyway, there's the Norwegian campaign, which again Hitler had no intention of doing until Britain mined Norway's ports, and then again he attacks France, which had declared war on Germany, and in order to essentially be secure on his western flank. Anyway, so then he goes on about the campaign in the West. And then Western and Northern Europe, once that's done, the British have, escaped at Dunkirk. Again, that was, Hitler did allow them to escape at Dunkirk. He could have absolutely destroyed the British expeditionary force in France, but instead he held off with his bombing in order to allow them to escape, just to show the British that he doesn't want a war with them. He wants a settlement. Again, this is nothing controversial. I mean, Liz Cheney may not know this, Sohrab Ahmari may not know this, or Josh Hammer may not know this, but all of this is accepted history. The attack on Norway was triggered by the British mining Norway's ports. The attack on France came in response to a French declaration of war against Germany, and Hitler held off bombing the British expeditionary force and allowed them to escape at Dunkirk. So anyway, so Cooper goes on, there's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent. In other words, the war is over and the German won. And then he goes on that the Hitler, if Hitler's firing of radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets on London and British City, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want war, to fight, you want to fight, and are you offering peace proposals? You keep your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. And I think this is correct. Hitler said, we don't have any claims on any of your colonies, including, incidentally, Germany. Remember, Germany had its colonies taken from during World War I, and Hitler made no attempt to say, "Hey, we'd like these colonies back," even though they were now under the control of the British and the French and the Belgians. But Hitler said, "Okay, we're not interested in getting our colonies back." But he's saying, hey, we're happy, Britain, you have your empire, you have your overseas empire. We have no interest in interfering with that, but we will dominate the European continent. And of course, the subtext here is that the real threat was from communism and the Soviet Union, and Hitler knew that many among Britain's elite, many among France's elite, regarded Soviet Union and communism as far greater threats than Nazi Germany. And so anyway, Cooper says, needs Britain to be strong, especially in the face of the communist threat. And then Cooper goes on, I think there were people in Britain who if they hadn't put it, if they hadn't been successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland, that people would have understood, like, we don't need, and so Churchill, I mean, you have a guy who Churchill wanted a war, he wanted to fight Germany, and the reason, I don't begrudge him that, people can national leaders, you can fight whoever you want. If you feel like your long-term interests of the British Empire threatened by the rise of a powerful continental power like Germany, and you need to check that those are great power games, you need to play them the way you feel like you. So he's basically saying here that, well, Churchill believed this, that somehow Britain was threatened by a European continent dominated by Germany. And it's, I mean, you can make that argument, but it still doesn't really make sense to go to war. I mean, yeah, you can, in an abstract way, it is true that a continent dominated by Germany may, in the long term, be detrimental to British interests. But even then, it was questionable because of the Soviet Union. It's very hard to see how Germany could have really dominated the continent, given the size and scale of the Soviet Union. but Britain's strength was never Europe. Britain's strength was its empire, its Commonwealth, its all its overseas possessions, its naval power, its banking and financial power. None of that was in any way threatened by German domination of the continent. So then Cooper goes on, the reason I resent Churchill so much, is that he kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending firebomb fleets. Sending firebomb fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just rank terrorism, to kill is the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as possible. And all the men were out in the field, all the fighting age men were out in the field. And so it's old people, it's women and children, and they knew that, and they were wiping these places out as gigantic scale terrorist attacks, the greatest scale of terrorist attacks seen in the world history. So what he's saying here is that Hitler was just determined to keep this war going. He had no means of doing anything about Poland. He had no means of doing anything about France. There's no way Britain just didn't have forces to invade the continent. So all he had was bombing. And essentially it was bombing civilians. That is correct. I mean, it was a campaign of bombing civilians, and Cooper rightly points out that the terror bombing of World War II was started by Britain. It was not started by Nazi Germany. But the Germans again were very wary of going down the path of bombing civilians, but and also they knew that Churchill was seeking to provoke this, and that somehow Churchill wanted Germany to bomb London and British cities in order to mobilize the public against Germany, so the public would get enthused about the war. So for some time, Hitler did hold back on bombing British cities, even though the British were bombing German cities, and it clearly was targeted at civilians. I mean, they were not going after any military facilities. But the goal all along was to keep the war going. The longer you can keep the war going, the more likely it is that somebody's going to get involved. And I think that was the Churchillian strategy. But in keeping the war going, that led to the deaths of billions of people. Because of course, if the British are determined to keep the war going, then the Germans really need to do whatever they need to do in order to avoid defeat. And so Germany had to continue to expand the war in order to avoid defeat. So therefore, Hitler had no plans to attack Yugoslavia until basically the British engineered a coup in Yugoslavia after Yugoslavia had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. The British engineered a coup, overthrew the king who had signed the non-aggression pact, and then Hitler attacked, because of course, if Yugoslavia then becomes a belligerent, then that creates the soft underbelly of Europe. This was a beloved concept of Churchill's, whereby the British could, in theory, mount an invasion of Europe via the Balkans, so by Greece and Yugoslavia, which is kind of what they did during World War I. So therefore, again, that triggered the coup in Belgrade, triggered Hitler's attack on the Balkans. so the war can continue to expand. And again, that's why the Churchill was determined to keep the war going, and by keeping the war going, then the war continued to expand. And the more it expanded, then of course the more lives were lost. So and so he says, why would he do that? Tucker asks him, because it was the only means that they had to continue fighting. They didn't have the ability to re-invade Europe, and so he needed to keep this war going until he accomplished what would you hope to accomplish? We know now there's actually a really great series of books, and it talks about the British special operations in the Second World War. And then says this was the propaganda campaign that the British launched in the United States to get the Americans into the war. So operations, propaganda operations, everything that they were running in the United States to eventually drag us into the war. And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was, we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. The war is over. We need either the Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us. And that was the plan. It kept the war going. Enough of that plan come to fruition. So that's, there's a lot more in this interview, where maybe we'll get into it during tomorrow's live stream, because of course he does bring up the interesting issue, which others have brought up, which is Churchill's relationship to Zionism, and why was he such an ardent Zionist throughout his life. But I think what there are, as I said, there are questionable things that he asserted here. So this is by no means do I accept the things that he's saying. But the arguments that he has made may have been about Britain's involvement, that specific issue of Britain going to war against Nazi Germany. I think he is right. And I think that, this is ground that others have already trodden. Of course, David Irving has written about this. H.P. Taylor blazed the trail really long ago in the late 1950s, the origins of the Second World War. Churchill, of course, didn't go that far. So did I say Churchill? I think Taylor, I meant to say Taylor didn't go that far. But he kind of said, look, the truth is Hitler was absolutely determined to go the extra mile to avoid a war with England, whom he admired. Strangely enough, he kind of rather admired the British. So Taylor blazed the trail. I think David Irving wrote about this, and I think John Charmley has written about this. And I think that somehow that war made absolutely no sense. Where I think Cooper, adds a particular resonance or bitterness to the story, and I think it's fair, is that the Churchill was determined to keep the war going when there was no need for it, and that by doing that, essentially, millions and millions of lives were lost. There was no real need for that, but the millions of lives were lost because he wanted that war. It was an unnecessary war. It had nothing to do with British national interest. In fact, we know after 1945, Britain was a much diminished power, something that was obvious to observers before the war, including Neville Chamberlain, who knew Britain will become a much diminished power as a result of fighting this war, would lose its empire, lose its its economic and financial power. But Churchill didn't really care about any of that, and so I think that's it's very useful to address that issue particularly. And this is in Britain. I think is very different. In Britain, I think Nobody really admired Churchill very much, except briefly, after the war, up until his death in 1965. I think he was then a revered figure, but pretty soon after that, I think his reputation declined, and he wasn't a much beloved figure, to say the least, before the war. So the British, are not exactly great fans of Churchill, but in the United States, he holds a kind of a saintly presence, and challenging him here, causes an enormous emotional reaction. Again, wouldn't cause any kind of an emotional reaction in Britain, but in the United States, which is wedded to all that's ideology about World War II and appeasement, and of course the glorious state of Israel. You attack Churchill, and everyone's going to come after you. Anyway, I think we'll talk more about it tomorrow during the live stream. I just wanted to alert gagglers to the meltdown that's currently taking place on Twitter. So Tucker Carlson's doing a rather good job in provoking this kind of hysteria. It's all to the good. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.